Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA for the week ending August 12, 2016. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Jay Rosen, Mr. Translations of Merrill Brink. And this week we talk about several different issues. We start off with Lily King, the Olympics, finger wagging and calling out the Russian Yulia Efimova for her history of doping. We move to the Second Court of Appeals upholding the Securities and Exchange Commission in-house administrative law program and what they might mean for FCPA cases going forward. We talk about a very interesting article in the New York Times entitled Driven to Suicide by Inhuman Pressure to Sell, which discusses the suicide of a top Abbott Laboratories salesman in India due to the pressure the company put on him to increase sales and what that might mean for tone at the top and culture. We talk about the Airbus investigation by the Serious Fraud Office in the United Kingdom around allegations of bribery and corruption and the use of third parties to make airliner sales in emerging markets. I query Jay about his appearance on Leona Lewis's podcast, The Masters of Disaster, and specifically around his thoughts on the budgeting process. This is not something that's talked about in compliance very often, but Jay had some really interesting thoughts on how the chief compliance officer or compliance practitioner should think about budgeting and using FCPA compliance products and services and how to work through that. As always, Jay tells us about his weekend wrap-up, and I talk about the upcoming Red Flag Group webinar on our continuing series on supply chain risk management. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to This Week in FCPA. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA for the week ending August 12th, 2016. As always, I'm joined by my cohort, and general all-around my favorite homer of all time with the NFL season starting, Tom Brady-less, Jay Rosen. Jay, welcome.
Hey, Tom. Good to finally overcome our technical difficulties and get together on GoToMeeting.
Indeed. So how is Mrs. Sales enabled today?
Mrs. Sales enabled is at Burbank Airport now. She's flying back east to DC for a conference, and it's going to be me and Millie and Michaela on our own for 5 days of chaos here at the Rosen household, and then we will busily clean up right before Mommy gets back home. So that's my agenda for the next 5 days.
My favorite thing about that situation when my daughter was that age was that meant I got to eat everything she wanted. So it was a very cool time for Dad. So anyway, Jay, we've had a interesting week, I thought, in FCPA and compliance and ethics, anti-corruption, and lots of different issues pop up. I think probably the thing that's on most people's minds right now, though, is the Olympics. And you drew some inspiration from some of the events around the Olympic competition. So why don't you tell us how those relate to compliance and ethics?
Sure. So it's really just, I think, a story about somebody who really follows their heart and their commitment. And there's an image that was burned into my mind that there's a U.S. swimmer, Lily King, and she was watching one of her competitors who was a Russian swimmer who supposedly shouldn't have been swimming because they were doping. And there's a great visual of her watching the other swimmer on TV kind of wagging her finger. And I'm not sure if she's saying that she's number one or she's saying, tisk, tisk, you shouldn't do that. And, the article that was published in Inc. magazine said, the lone voice is often the right voice. I feel sure someone at Enron was raising questions about accounting practices, but no one listened. And I feel sure someone at Volkswagen was raising questions about diesel emissions, but no one listened. And when an employee speaks up, especially when doing so means breaking a cultural code of silence, make sure you listen. So I think in this one little moment where politics meets sports meets doping, that for a 19-year-old to kind of stand up and show us the way, really confirms a lot of things that we talk about on a week-to-week basis.
It was a really interesting point and a very poignant moment in Olympics, as in all Olympics have numerous poignant moments, but that was certainly one from our world of compliance and ethics. But we also had a legal opinion this week that I thought was very interesting. The Securities and Exchange Commission, of course, has long had an in-house ALJ or administrative law judge proceeding and process. And after the Dodd-Frank came into being in 2010, the SEC has expanded that greatly to a number of other cases, including FCPA cases. And there's been several defendants in SEC actions and civil actions have contested the constitutionality of these ALJs and basically giving Article 3 power to people who hadn't gone through a process such as federal district judges. Nevertheless, the Second Circuit upheld the administrative law judge role by the Securities and Exchange Commission. I would note that we have not had any contested FCPA cases go through the ALJ process, only agreed settlement orders. So in the FCPA world, we haven't had contested process yet through the ALJ process, but we could certainly going forward. But this is a huge win for the SEC. It confirms a longstanding policy that they've had. I don't think there's really anything new here, but it was the Second Circuit, and that's a very powerful circuit. Jay, unfortunately, we had an article in the New York Times, and I was really stunned about the scope of this article. And that article dealt with a salesman for Abbott, a pharmaceutical company in India, who was driven to suicide because of the pressure he was put under. And it was, I don't know the word count of the article, but it was a huge article with a lead in and then a jump page into the lead in on the front page and a jump page into the business section that was really a full page long that detailed the sales practices of Abbott. This was not, unfortunately, a one-off individual. They had a large number of complaints by Abbott employees about the sales pressure they're under. And really, Jay, what it led me to think about was, why is there continue to be violations of anti-corruption laws such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the UK Bribery Act? Well, when you have sales quotas, sales pressures, sales requirements that cause people to actually commit suicide, I think that points to a large part of the problem. And the conduct that Abbott salesmen in India engaged in, they didn't detail any specific FCPA violations, but they did detail some alleged violations of Indian law that the salesmen were engaged in. And I don't know what the Department of Justice will be looking at, but they well could open up an investigation. But it really points to the high pressure nature of many jobs. And I thought a lot about this because I think you and I have both in a previous life worked in some pretty high pressure positions. And the attitude, I think, for you in the entertainment industry, for me in a law firm, in private practice, it was, if you can't take the heat, you need to get out of the kitchen. Not a lot of sympathy for people who wanted a balance of work life, an 8-to-5 job, or anything close to that. And certainly I accepted that. I think probably you did too at one point in your professional career. So I'm a little bit torn when people bring up things like, well, they're working too hard. But this was really 10 paces past that. This was really direct pressure to make sales so badly that a person felt the only option they had was to commit suicide. And it really points to, I think, the larger problem and indeed tension in corporations. You've got to sell. That's why you're a corporation. That's why you're a business. But if you push so hard that people, strike, people commit suicide or engage in other activities that's counterproductive, directly counterproductive, and direct protest of the conduct, it does point to a larger problem. So a very interesting article in the Times.
One thing that I'd like to kind of use that as a jump off is also this week our European airplane manufacturer Airbus has made the news, and again, it seems like a big cultural difference and some pressure to make sales that there is a gentleman that was quoted in the article, a guy named Richard Abulafia, and I probably butchered his name. He's an analyst for a Virginia-based group called the Teal Group. And he says U.S. aerospace companies always looked on with envy at the relative laxity of controls of their European rivals, and especially their relationships with middlemen. And then this is, quote, "The joke in the U.S. defense industry used to be, here it's illegal," meaning bribery, there it's tax deductible. And so he's referring to the practice of paying fees to third-party agents. That might not be quite true anymore, but that's been the U.S. viewpoint. So here again, we've got Boeing, who is playing by the rules, who is not using third-party agents, and now we have Airbus, who is directly, in contravening that type of situation. So I guess it's not even really specific just to the pharma industry, right? It's defense, it's pharma, it's any type of high-pressure situation where you need to make sales. And just to kind of reinforce the tragedy of what you've said, that this young man who was rising in his career and just bought an apartment and bought a home and thought he was really making it for his family, because he was not able to make these aggressive quotas, found that there was only one way out. And another thing that I found interesting in that article was some of the sales managers in the boiler room said, look, you're missing, you're about $320 worth of short of your quota, so I want you to buy the drugs yourself. So Right. They were so intent on making their numbers that they were using their meager salaries to buy the drugs, and it's just it's just really tragic and important.
So let me go back to Airbus, because there's a lot in that story for the compliance practitioner and listeners to these this week in FCPA. First of all was Airbus's use of third-party agents in emerging markets. Clearly, that's a huge red flag, and they didn't manage that very well. Second of all was the response that you read or you discussed from the U.S. business community, specifically Boeing, who has gone through their own anti-corruption scandals and scandals over the years, have a very robust anti-corruption compliance program, very public about their commitment to doing business ethically and in compliance with laws. And here we have the British government in the form of the Serious Fraud Office actually taking a very strong stance against the European air manufacturer. So this, I think, is exactly what American manufacturers want to see, a leveling of the playing field. There's one other wrinkle in this that we typically don't see in many FCPA cases at any rate, and that was the British Export Financing Agency, kind of the UK equivalent to the Export-Import Bank that's been in the news a lot lately, XM. They had guaranteed financing for Airbus, and Airbus had been required to have a compliance program which either managed third-party relationships such as Airbus had, or did not, or required Airbus to disclose them, neither of which they did. So it drove home to me the kind of business solution to laws, anti-corruption laws, where financiers are requiring best practices compliance programs. And I've seen that in private equity companies. I had Matt Ellison on a podcast where he talked about the presentations he makes to private equity firms looking to invest in his clients in Latin America, where one of the first questions is talk about the compliance program. Many banks now require a best practices compliance program in the context of their loan covenants that you must have during the pendency of the loan. And now we see it from a government agency. So I thought that was kind of an interesting wrinkle as well. Jay, there was you had one event this week that I wanted to talk to you about, because you really touched on a business component of compliance that we rarely discuss. So you were on Masters of Disaster, the Leona Lewis podcast. I always tip my hat to Leona. She was the second person in compliance to start podcasting. So, but you were on Masters of Disaster, and in a wide-ranging talk, I thought, you hit on one point that really struck with me, and that was the budgeting process. You talked about how compliance professionals, how chief compliance officers obviously need to think about what they want, but they got to do more than think about it. They've actually got to reduce it to writing, and then they have to send it up through the budgeting process, and not just pick up the phone and say, oh, we're going to hire Tom Fox to do this, or we're going to hire Merrill Brink to do that. This was actually thinking about what you would need in calendar year 2017 or beyond, putting it in the budgeting process, articulating your business justification. So maybe you could, having had a little bit more time in the corporate world than me, perhaps you could explain what the budgeting process is, why it's starting sometimes. I've been in some companies that started in July, but certainly it's appropriate for it to start in August, and how that relates to the compliance professional.
Sure. One of the things is, I think if you go back to if it isn't written down, it doesn't get done. And one of the things that you are looking at is, if you're a chief compliance officer or if you're somebody there, you've got your goals that need to be achieved in a given calendar year. And then one of the things that we're going to suggest that you do is do a risk-based analysis of where that money needs to be spent, because unfortunately, unless you're under investigation or doing some serious remediation, you do not have an endless supply of capital. So, one of the things that I might counsel my clients on is, if they're doing business in 28 countries and they need to translate into 18 or 19 languages, we may give them an estimate on what it would cost to do the code of conduct and associated policies and procedures, and maybe we come back with that number, and that number is $80,000, and their budget is only $30,000. So we have to help them, come up with a strategy that will not only work for their budget, but that will also work for their business. So besides doing a risk-based analysis and saying that you are doing business in X jurisdiction, whether, let's say, it's Russia or Brazil or Mexico, that might have more potential red flags and higher risks. At that point, we might say, well, let's look at this and do it as a 3-year program. So in year 1, where your budget may only be $30,000 versus the 80 you need, let's take care of those languages that are more important, and then we can look at this over a 2 to 3 year horizon. So when you get to the end of that cycle, you will have ended up translating all the languages that you need, but you have just done it over a longer period. So that's one way we try to take a look at it. But this whole budgeting process is it's really kind of tied to profit centers, and the thing is going to be, how much more profitable are you going to be if you do these translations? And it's almost, from our perspective, we're going to look at it as what kind of potential situations will you avoid. So it's almost like it's not a profit per se, but it's what will you avoid losing in profitability by not going through this exercise of budgeting and then making the business case for your resources. And to tie it back to something, we'd see that on an individual movie, that when I was at Fox and we were budgeting a film, this dates myself, but when I was there in the early to mid 90s, it used to cost about $100,000 a day to roll a camera. So if you broke up a script and realized that the script was going to take 90 days to shoot, just for your physical costs on that, you'd have $9 million sunk in there. And if you didn't have that in the budget, if you only had $7 million, well, guess what? You're not jumping that car over the bridge. You're rewriting the scene. So it's almost the equivalent to that is, in budgeting season, you're almost recasting your script, or you're redoing your movie, and you're realizing that you still need to be competitive for the rest of the year, and you need your resources. So either you've got to go in and take resources from another department, or you have to alter how you're going to achieve what you need and look at it over a longer time horizon.
So I know that's something that we really do not talk enough about in the dialogues around the compliance profession, but I really like your point about breaking down or breaking out on a risk rank basis the tools and services that you need. And if you plan those out over a series of years, perhaps you can get to where you want to be with your budget constraints, with your resource constraints. But the important part is that you have to plan that, and you have to go through that exercise, and you have to really work with a professional product or service provider like yourself to understand how you can do that, how everyone can come out ahead in that game, or that process, I should say. So I thought it was a really interesting point you raised. And I was glad that you talked about that, and glad that we could explore that a little bit more in this particular podcast.
Great. So
anything Merrill Brink or Mr. Translations have coming up of note?
Vacation next week.
Well, how about what's in the weekend report?
In the weekend report, I thought I'd revisit one of our favorite discussions, which we really haven't seen much of this year, which would be successor liability. Mm-hmm. And a couple of weeks we talked about Zimmer Biomet. On the 8th, they just filed their quarterly filings, and once again, they confirmed that their DPA has been extended, and it seems like they're having some issues with the Biomet unit. And when you read these things, it just jumps off, and it says Zimmer bought Indiana-based Biomet last year for $14 billion, and the orthopedic device maker, now known as Zimmer Biomet, the combined company is liable for FCPA penalties Biomet may incur. So, this is that casebook situation, and from a proactive perspective, if you look at something like GE's acquisition of Alstom, they're doing the same thing. So I don't think this is a surprise at all to the folks there, but it's just it's very big numbers, and it's a very big liability, and part of it is them settling DPAs and them being extended and going forward. So I think it'd just be instructive for folks to take a look at their filing, and just to really back to the point you were making with Matt, and in terms of any type of acquisition, I really don't think we see enough FCPA due diligence at the front end of a transaction. I think corporations spend their money doing diligence on looking at quality of earnings and looking at revenue and looking at processes, but they really don't go up front and say, can we see the compliance program that you and your company have? Can we see how this actually works in the field? And my question is, would this have been significant enough? And if they found out in time, would it have prevented Zimmer from wanting to merge with Biomet? So that's one thing I want to put up. And then I would also like to put up your blog that you had guests written by Maurice Gilbert. It's, again, following more on due diligence. And this situation is really great that he has a list that's an ongoing list of questions that if you are an incoming chief compliance officer going to a new company and interviewing that company, that you actually perform third-party, or not third-party, but you do your due diligence on this place.
Right.
And some of the questions to ask is, what happened to my predecessor? Why isn't he here? Will I have board independence? If I need to make a decision that may or may not run counter to the company, may I have direct access to the CEO? So again, looking at red flags, but looking at it from a perspective of, if somebody is no longer the chief compliance officer there, I'd like to know the situation that I'm walking into ahead of time. And I think a lot of times when people go into an interview, they're so used on selling to themselves that it shows some real critical thinking, that if you can go into a situation like this and show how you can start providing value from day one, I think you'll get looked at in a much different light, and hopefully you will start to create that culture of compliance, and you will afford yourself a position that you can go into and start immediately making a difference. So I think it's a great list of questions, and I think it's going to be added to and available on his website. Is that correct?
It is available on his website. I'll link to his list of questions on the show notes. The thing I'd like to talk about or bring up is I'm pleased to be part of another Red Flag Group webinar next week. We're in a series on supply chain risk management, and on this webinar, supply chain expert Jared Connors and I talk about how do you begin to risk rank your supply chain so that you can then move to the risk management process. The webinar is Thursday, August 18th, 10 o'clock Central. You can check it out at the Red Flag Group website, which is www.redflaggroup.com, and then click the webinars tab. It's free and it's very informative. So I hope any listeners interested in supply chain risk management will check it out. So Jay, it seems like we're at the end of this week's episode, and I look forward to your weekend report, and I very much look forward to seeing Dad next Friday morning after a week with the girls, and see what your blood sugar level is. We'll probably need full medical scans and reports, plus, of course, your suntan from being at the pool and other outdoor activities that young children enjoy.
Well, it's as you know, when you had your time with Paris, it's a fun time. 8-year-olds is a great age, and 2 8-year-olds, I guess I'm almost dealing with a 16-year-old young lady, because when those two gals get together and one plots a crime and the other one executes it. So I tell you, we are going to be having a lot of time, a lot of fun, and maybe I will even take your advice, Tom, and do a little retail therapy with them.
Well, good. All right. Looking forward to continuing the conversation.
All right. Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining us as we do every weekend, taking a look at the FCPA week that was. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in the FCPA.